Today's topic is interviewing. I believe interviewing is the most important search because it's the gatekeeper between you and a job. You can get a lot of help on a resume and filling out an application and creating a LinkedIn profile. But generally, when you get to the interview process, it's you. And this is where a lot of people um, kind of just, well, they may think that they're just going to let their professionalism show and they're going to be very natural and they don't want to sound scripted. And in many cases, that doesn't go very well because it comes off as being unprepared. So before we get started, I do want to let you know that CareerForce as a system may be closed physically, but we are open virtually. And that means more than just these presentations that we're giving online. You local CareerForce location to set up a resume review, a mock interview, which we'll be talking about later, to a guided career assessment. There's a lot of things we can offer over the phone and online. So at the end of today's presentation, you'll be given the information on how to connect with your local CareerForce location. The reason that is so important is the local locations are going to have that information specific to employers in your area. And it's really important to establish that local connection. Out to your local CareerForce for Veterans Employment Services to learn more about the Dislocated Worker Program and for vocational rehabilitation services. Today is the job interview. Next week, we will be doing Facing Unemployment at 50 and Older. That is always a very popular presentation. And then with the new year, we'll be starting the 6-part series all over again. The job interview. What we hope you gain from this is after this presentation, you're going to know how to prepare for an interview. You're going to know how the various types of interviews are laid out. You're going to know how to communicate your best image in an interview. And that's not just about how you dress. It's a lot about body language, and we'll be talking about that. One of the questions we get quite, how do we answer those tough interview questions? And we're going to be going over the most common interview questions that give people problems. We'll be able to answer those difficult questions, like why did you lose your job? Why are you here today? Why are you applying for a job that is below your qualifications? It's really important to have answers to those. We're going to talk extensively about the STAR method of answering questions. I think it's the most important thing you can practice in preparing for an interview, other than the research you put in the company. And then we'll talk about post-interview steps. Thank you letters, interview follow-up, that sort of thing. We'll also be taking your questions. And as soon as I see Marnie's video come on, I'll know that there is a question, and we'll pause for that to answer as many as we can get to. So first off, when you're preparing for an interview, it's very obvious when I interview someone if they've researched not only this position, but the company. So when you apply for a job, you should be doing this, but especially if you get make sure that you research the job, research the employer, go over the website. When scheduling the interview, ask questions about the interview process, who you'll be interviewing with and how long it will last. I've had people cut short an interview because they didn't realize it was an hour and a half. They thought it was an hour, and they said, I'm sorry, I have to leave in the middle of the interview. And those are things that we can ask beforehand so that we can plan accordingly. You want to verify the address or location of the interview, as well as the contact information. Who are you going to call in case there's an emergency? That does not mean you lost that job simply because you're late. How you handle it and make that determination whether you have that opportunity or not. I've had people call in and say, I apologize, I'm running a bit late. And, that's a professional thing to do. It's not an easy call to make, but it's much better than having them sit in a room for 15 minutes waiting for you. Review the job description. You should make sure that you fully understand what the needs are of the position, and then study the company website, any brochures or annual reports. Go on, follow that company on LinkedIn, maybe on Facebook. Find out what they're putting out there on social media. You're going to need to know the skills they are requiring for this job. So important there is you have to make the connection between what they need you have to offer. So study how your skills, your experience, and employment history match what the company requests. That's all what an interview is all about, is making that connection between what they need and what you can do for them. Be prepared to discuss your skills gaps and come up with counterpoints. Convince the employer that you can and will learn that skill. Until the end of the year, we have this wonderful opportunity called Coursera. I'll be giving everyone information on how to register for that, but it has to be done by the end of this year. It's an opportunity to access 4,800 courses, certificate courses on things as wide-ranging as contract tracing for COVID and staying positive within the pandemic, but also some skills-based classes like Microsoft Excel, Word, programming in Python, SQL, all sorts of different things. If you don't have something an employer needs, it's important to say what you're doing to gain the. You're in process. Of course, the most important thing is experience. But if you don't have that experience, be willing to say what you're willing to do to gain that experience. So have a plan to improve your skills. A lot of people are unemployed right now. The way to separate yourself from your competition is to show what you're doing now to enhance your career. And then check your attitude. Employers are looking for people with positive work attitude. And that can come across in an interview. Everyone's nervous in an interview. At least you should be a little nervous. When someone comes in with no nerves at all, that's a little scary for me as an employer because there's a lot of unknowns for both of us at this point. I'm not saying you have to fake nervousness, but if you're a little nervous, that's okay. You still need to show a positive attitude that you think you can do this job, could learn this job. Size attitude over skills, training, and experience. I'm willing to train the right candidate as long as I have the right attitude. The resume and the application, that kind of determines if you're qualified for this job. I don't interview people who are not qualified. Now that I have 5 candidates that are qualified, I want to see who has the best attitude and who I could train to do this specific job. So don't leave that off. You need to smile. You don't need to make jokes, but you need to be positive. So look to show your enthusiasm, and willingness to learn, and really point out for an employer why you want to work there, why you would be happy working there. People who are working someplace stay longer, so there's a larger return on investment for the employer who trains you in. That's a huge gamble to hire anybody because before they can do work for you, you need to train them to do that. During that time, they lose money. They're looking for, once I train this person in, they're going to be a return on investment. And people who are happy in their job generally do that. And then you want to look good. You want to look as professional as possible within your industry. And that means think about what is the standard dress for that position. And that can be tricky. When in doubt, dress a little bit above it. In fact, I always dress one step above what the job requires. So if the job requires a dress shirt, I wear a dress shirt and a tie. If it's a dress shirt and a tie, I wear a suit. But if it's a job that requires jeans and shirt, then maybe I'm going to wear khakis and a dress shirt. An employer may think if you don't care about your personal experience, you may not care about the job. And there's a lot to that above and beyond just what you wear. One of the things to keep in mind, and we may mention this later, keep any scents, like a cologne or perfume. Don't wear them because most employers nowadays, and the state of Minnesota, who I work for, is one of them, will not allow scents. It's a scent-free work environment. And if you go in with a very nice smelling perfume, you have just broken company policy by not researching the company and knowing what that policy is. When in doubt, leave it off. So the types of interviews. Don't get too hung up on the names because they can kind of blend together, especially now. But this gives you some general types of interviews. So the purpose of an interview is to get acquainted. It's about both you and them. And most people, myself included, tend to think, my gosh, they've got all the power. I mean, that's what it feels like. They do. They have the job, but you have your time, you have your skills, you have your experience, you have a lot to offer. So it's about a give and take. So have a purpose. Don't just respond to their questions. Have a reason for being there. Have a plan, and you can work that plan into the way you answer their questions. So a couple of different types of interviews, and these are even more common now because of the pandemic, is the telephone interview. In the past, a telephone interview would be a screening interview, and this would help an employer to take maybe the top 20 candidates and then funnel it down to maybe the best or the most qualified 5. So this helps to eliminate candidates based on criteria such as education, required skills, and also who I'm seeing on paper, is that the same person I'm talking to? Many people, and we encourage this, by the way, many people get help on their resume. Sometimes that goes to the extent that it's the person who created the resume that's being promoted at you. It's not your words, it's someone else's words. And that becomes very obvious when you do a quick telephone screening. If it's who I'm looking at is who I'm getting. And that really helps to save both parties time. You don't want to interview for a job that you have absolutely no chance at in most cases. And an employer certainly doesn't want to interview an unqualified candidate. It helps, so be organized on a telephone interview and be prepared for them to happen unexpectedly. If you are driving, it's okay to say, I'm in transit right now, if you even answer that phone, but with the hands-free, some people will. I wouldn't recommend taking an interview while you're driving. Just say, I'm in transit right now. If you could give me 15 minutes to get off the freeway, I would be happy to call you back, or you could give me a call back at this number. I've actually done that before, and it's worked very well. If you need to reschedule, let the interview know beforehand. Even if you're dropping out of a job, make sure to call. You don't want to burn any bridges anywhere, and every community is a small community, and you never know who that person knows or whether you're going to apply at that company again. If you do not show up for an interview and don't let them know, it's just unprofessional. This is left. But there is something called an in-person screening. This is a screening interview to eliminate candidates based on criteria very similar to what the telephone interview would be. I've only done this once when we had the floods in Duluth about 8-10 years ago. FEMA came in and they wanted to hire a ton of people for cleanup. And so we interviewed screening interviews for hundreds of people per day. And the idea there was to make sure that people could show up, that they had their social security card, that they had a picture ID, because that would have been one of the requirements. And it helped them get a kind of a filtered list together very, very quickly. Interview could be multiple interviews, and you may meet with multiple people. So this could be, step 2 or 3 in the process. It could be when they get down to the final 2 candidates. And in that case, it's going to be very, very focused on the job. The needs of the job. Some interviews are just a pre-functionary call on the phone, making sure you still want the job and you got it. Other processes can be very time consuming. And I always say don't give up on the process, but also don't wait on the process. You should still be exploring other signals, other opportunities. I've been in a 3-month process that didn't work out. If I had waited that entire time to apply for other positions, I'd be 3 months behind. And then one of the ones that's very important we'll be talking about with the STAR technique is behavioral interviewing. This helps employers to find more information about your on-the-job behavior, and that's the key here. Soft skills, behavior, personality, and character. So instead of saying, how do you fix this machine, it would be something like, give me a time in which you couldn't get an order out on time. How did you contact the customer, and what were the results of that situation? So it makes you think about what you did interpersonally to solve an issue with a coworker, a boss, a customer, a vendor. Those are very hard with off the top of your head. So if you're going to practice anything, practice those behavioral-based interviewing questions. I'll be sending everyone a worksheet on behavioral-based interviewing and the STAR method, which we'll go through step by step here in a few slides. One of the ones that's not as common, but I have been a part of, is the group or peer group. So this would be an opportunity to meet with coworkers. So they might have like a panel interview and bring along a couple of employees. And they can have, absolutely can have a say on who was eventually picked for that job. So make sure that anyone you deal with in the interview process, you're treating equally. You are giving your attention to the person who asks the question. People make the mistake of focusing on who they believe is the decision maker. So, someone asks a question and then they go to the other person who they think is the decision maker to answer. And that's never a good look in an interview. There is one other type. I'm going to briefly mention two other types. One is a stress interview, and that would be where someone would purposefully put you on guard by maybe pushing your buttons a little bit. And the reason for that is the job itself would require that. So if I were a collections agent, they may ask me some very stressful questions and kind of put me on my guard to see if I can handle that stress. I've been involved in a stress interview. It's not fun. However, it's the best way of determining whether I'm qualified for that job. Can I handle it? And even though it may seem a little bit like a put on, like it's fake, in the interview, it becomes very real. And you get very nervous. At least I did. However, just answer calmly. Say, I see you're passionate about that. Let me see if I can come up with a good answer for you. Don't react to the tone. Understand what they're trying to get at and do your best to answer the question. And then the other one is a work sample interview. That's where you do part of the job as part of the interview. A lot of industries don't allow for that, but something like welding, to see if you're a good welder, I want to see you weld. And I may bring you into the shop and have you weld a few pieces. I'm going to take just a brief moment here and see if Marnie has any questions before we move on.
Sure, I've got a really good one here. Sometimes job postings can be very vague about requirements and about the role. So it's really hard to tailor answers when I'm not sure exactly what the job responsibilities are. There's been some good discussion about this and some ideas, but what is your advice here, Art?
Well, that to me is where your research in the company comes into play. Some companies do put cookie cutter, job postings out there, maybe because they don't have much of an HR department, or maybe that's just the way they want to put it out there to see how people react. But that is where I think you can separate yourself from everyone else, because it's easy just to say, well, I can't prepare for this. The very, very interested job seeker will take the extra time to network, maybe with someone who works at that company, find out what the needs of that position are, or go on the website and find out more information that's not in the job posting. And again, the key is find out what the needs of the job are, however you do that, and then make the connection with what you can do, your experience in doing similar things are.
And what about those job postings that are basically, and sometimes outrightly, asking for someone to be a Jack or Jill of all trades, to be literally able to do anything and up for anything?
Yeah. If you ask an employer this, of course they're going to say, nope, if we put it in the job posting, you have to have all these things. But there is a difference between required skills and extra skills. And they list that a whole bunch of different ways. Secondary skills, good to have skills, however they put it. Very few people are qualified, immensely qualified for every aspect of a long job posting. Again, it's all about, do you meet the requirements of the required skills? Can you make a case for how you are in process or willing to learn those additional skills? I try not to self-filter myself out of a job I know I can do. However, some employers will stick to their guns on that, and they will say, hey, this was required, and that's why you didn't get the interview. It's different for every employer, but again, if you can do the majority of the job, if you got to the interview, I mean, it's probably not an issue, but they probably will still ask, okay, I don't see anything listed on SQL. Is that something you are in process with? And you say, oh yes, I'm taking a course on that. At expected completion date January 14th, something like that.
All right, last question for this little break. Are there any red flags, Art, that you can think of in job descriptions to keep in mind?
Yeah, one of the things that in a job description, if you get a feeling that, well, two things to keep in mind. The job description itself, if you see the same job being posted consistently or long term, doesn't mean it's not a good job, but that's a question you should ask. If there is a super high turnover rate for a position, or there is a job that they just can't fill because you've seen it for a long time on this site, that's not being inappropriate to tactfully ask, why has this job not been filled? Or I see that this job is posted every 2 to 3 months. I mean, a perfectly legitimate example of that is, well, this is an entry-level job, and we promote from this job and forward fill our positions. So that's why we keep posting this, and that's a great reason to apply for that job. But the other side of it is, if there is an 85, and I've seen this just recently, 85% turnover rate, you really got to ask yourself, is this the job that I could see myself in long term? Other things to keep in mind, by the way, is companies that are not specific about their location or about the job title. Sometimes with a staffing agency, you will see that because they're not allowed to at that stage. But if it's a company themselves and they're just not giving you enough information, it could be a scam. And I have seen that happen. It can even be a safety issue if it's taken off of like Craigslist or something like that. Do your research, make sure you know what the company is, where they're located, and what the actual job is before you meet in person. By the way, there are still interviews in person. A lot of them are happening over the phone and online, but there are still in-person interviews happening. All right, so communicating your best image. Get everything organized early. Have copies of everything you need and have a portfolio ready to go. And by portfolio, I mean extra copies of your resume, potentially your cover letter, reference, letters of reference if you have them, work samples possibly, copies of anything you list on your resume. So if you say you have a special engineering license, have a copy of that certificate. It's a really good leave-off. Once they hire you, they're going to require documentation of everything you've listed. And if you can hand it to them at the end of an interview, it's a really good look. It's a really good organized perception. Also, not everyone in an interview may have your resume. I know it seems silly, but I've been in multiple interviews where they didn't have a copy of my resume. And it felt really good to be able to pass one to each of the people there. I go overboard. I bring 10 copies of my resume, my cover letter, and my reference sheet. And I understand that that is probably way overboard. Bring at least 6, because I've been in interviews where I thought it was going to be 2-on-1 and it was 6-on-1. I just like to give myself that little bit of extra, sure that I know that I'm as prepared as I can be. Know the questions you're going to ask in an interview. Have 5 of them. Write them down. I only ask 2 or 3, but the reason I create 5 is so that if they give me information based on the question I was going to ask already, I'm not going to ask a question that was already answered. And if I don't have extra questions, I won't be prepared for that. So more than 80% of communication is nonverbal. So be aware of your facial expressions and body language. Read the interview, and even though we may not be doing firm handshakes anymore, good eye contact is important. And it's not easy. It's something that if you videotape yourself in a mock interview, you're going to be stunned in some cases about your body posture, how you're talking, how many times you say to interrupt yourself while you're thinking of something. So things we can do in a career force location. I really recommend you take advantage of this. If you're not comfortable with that at this stage, ask yourself some questions. Videotape yourself. Look at what your body's saying and the tone of voice is saying that you are not. Do it with a friend, a family member, but you can also come to us and set that up. I would recommend that you give yourself plenty of time. If you have an interview coming up, don't wait until the day before the interview to try to set up a mock interview. I've been able to turn that around. However, it's really hard to do. So you want to avoid being creepy or weird. I know that sounds strange, but sometimes the way, just mannerisms, we all have them. And sometimes we may say things that put an interviewer off. We may give too much personal information. And the key to that is that one question they ask at the beginning of most interviews: tell me a little bit about yourself. A little bit about yourself. And really how you should rephrase that in your mind is, tell me about your career up to this point that benefits me. I know that seems maybe a little pessimistic, but that's really what they want to know. I had someone answer that question. I had to cut that person off eventually. I got into a flow and they started talking about things, and it did get kind of weird and very uncomfortable to everyone in the room. Be aware that not only are you sending good signals, but you're reading their signals. You can generally tell if you're going too long on a question by the way the interviewer. They may, look at their notes, or they may lose eye contact. You can see they're losing interest. Be aware of that and adapt to it by cutting off your answer. I usually say 60 to 90 seconds is about the right time. Of course, there's exceptions to every rule on that, but that's something to shoot for. You want to show and tell. So you must back up statements with samples of productivity. So don't just say that you're really good at, creating spreadsheets. Give an example of how you've done that has benefited your employer. So use stories to illustrate your experience and emphasize your commitment to learning. I don't like this term anymore because it's used too much, but people will say, I'm a lifelong learner. If you're someone who really, truly likes to learn new things, that's a benefit to any employer. Then you want to finish up strong. You want to wrap up by summarizing any strengths or qualities you want them to remember. Never leave an interview without asking good questions. If, for some reason, before you ask questions, you realize that none of the questions they've asked have allowed you to talk about what you do best. So let me take a step back here. When I go into an interview, I look at the job description, I do some self-reflection on my skills, and I think, what are the 5 things they need to know about me for me to get this job? And those are my goals. That's my goal going into the interview. I'm going to tell them these 5 stories, or I'm going to talk about these 5 skills I have, and usually you can work them in through the questions they ask. Give me a time when. Well, you've got that story ready to answer that question. That's not always going to be enough, though. So at the end of an interview, I do a little checklist. And if at the end I've left something off the table and they say, do you have any questions for us? I say, I do, but there's one thing I'd like to add if I may. I've never run into an interviewer who has said, no, you may not. You may not add anything. They're going to allow you to do that. And that's your opportunity to kind of seal the deal. Pull it back around to how your experience benefits this job. And then also ask questions. And then one of the questions you should always ask is, what's the next step in this process? That's being proactive in your follow-up. If they say, well, we'll contact you within a week, I usually ask, if I haven't heard from you within this week, would it be okay if I follow that up with an email or a call? And then if you say you're going to do it, make sure to do it. I always follow up in one way or another, either through a thank you card or an updated resume, or I send them a letter of recommendation. I always want them to, after the interview, still be thinking about me. And if you don't follow up in some way, shape, or form, someone else probably will. And if it's a toss-up, that may be the deciding factor. After an interview, it's really important to evaluate the process. Think about your last interview that you took. And you don't have to put this in the chat, but just think about it. Do you remember every question they asked? Do you remember every answer you gave? If you don't, it's really hard to improve on your process. You will forget most of the questions and most of the answers fairly quickly. What I do after every interview is I write down everything I can remember. I mean, some people even give you the questions, and that's great. But if they don't, write down everything they asked, if you can, remember, how you answered it, and then any notes. Oh gosh, I wish I had done this. Or they didn't respond well to that. Or I got an odd look when I went on this tangent. The reason for that is those are your improvement points. Those are your opportunity to be better prepared next time. Also record your follow-up plans and make sure you do what you say you're going to do. So in every interview, you're going to be asked a few tough questions. At least you should be. The idea here is to, separate 5 into 4 potentials and 1 person who's getting that job. That is, they ask more direct, difficult questions. In handling those questions, there's a couple of methods we have. The first one is something called the sandwich method. So this would be a positive response. Now the negative has to be in there. If they ask you about a difficult situation, or that the one that everyone hates, your biggest weakness, I want you to answer the question I asked. That doesn't mean that you can't show what you're doing about it or show what you really like. Some difficult questions could be like, tell me about your worst boss. I love that question, by the way, because as an interviewer, I love that question. As a interviewee, it's very tough to ask because you've been told, and I'll tell you, don't throw your employer under the bus. Don't say anything bad about your employer. So don't. In that case, the positive, negative, positive could be, I got a new supervisor with a ton of experience in something I wanted to learn. Unfortunately, this supervisor was an email person, and I was a talk over the phone employee. So she was sending me 20 emails a day, and I couldn't keep up with it. And my performance really lacked. What I did was, after a few weeks of getting all these emails, I anticipated what she needed from me, and I proactively sent out an email at the beginning of the day, answering many of the questions and talking about how I would follow up at the end of the day. What happened there was the 20 emails a day turned to 2 to 3 emails a day. My performance improved, and we got along much better professionally once I adapted to her communication style. So that's talking about your worst boss, but it's putting it in I could learn from this person, and here's how I adapted. In the middle is a communication style I wasn't used to, and which caused my performance to suffer. That's the sandwich technique. You want to anticipate questions, gaps in employment, why you left your last job. You don't ever want to be asked a question and think, oh gosh, I just hope they don't ask me about that. I'm going to pretend they're not going to ask me about that. And then you'll come up with the emotional response to the question instead of the professional prepared response. And one of these would be, the hardest one to answer for a lot of people is, why did you leave your last job? We identify so much with what we do. It's the second question anyone asks you. It's, what's your name? And then, what do you do? When we lose that, it's very emotional. Even if we didn't like the job, we still identify as, this is where I went for 8 hours a day. And to explain that situation is very tough unless you're prepared for it. These are so situational that I recommend you talk one-on-one with a career force specialist if you were let go from a position, because every situation's a little bit different. And in doing that, you can turn what you're most dreading into just a little blip. If they're interviewing you, you have a chance at this job, and don't let how you answer a past employment be the reason you don't get this job. So I'll give you just a real quick example of this. I was working with a gentleman who had been fired from a position. And when someone would ask him, why did you leave your last job? He would say, well, I went to my father's funeral and they fired me. And that was just uncomfortable because I didn't know what to say. An employer wouldn't either. And he'd go on and talk about how horrible it was. We talked about that situation after he lost 6 opportunities. He'd answered every single time in 6 interviews, he'd answered similar questions with that answer. and he couldn't understand why he wasn't getting jobs because he was highly qualified. What we found out was, he was on FMLA, he exceeded FMLA, but at some point it got to a point where they could no longer accommodate, and that straw that broke the camel's back was him leaving for 10 days without calling his employer about a funeral. We turned it into we did the sandwich method. He said, I've worked in my last job for 7 years, was the top salesman for that division. Really enjoyed the customers I worked with. Unfortunately, I was dealing with a sick loved one for the last year of my employment, and it got to a point where they could no longer accommodate, past FMLA, the absences I had to do it to take care of my parents, and they ended up hiring someone else. That is no longer an issue going forward. That situation has resolved itself, and throughout my entire career, I have otherwise exhibited excellent attendance. Okay, he answered the question, didn't throw his employer under the bus, and he got his next job. That was why, because he was highly qualified. So be prepared for those tough questions. Don't tell a lie in an interview. We do massage the truth a little bit, and they say, tell me about your most difficult your most difficult customer. We're not going to tell them the truth as we see it, that, this person was just horrible and I didn't like them, but we're also not going to lie about it. We're not going to say, I like this person. We're going to talk about the situation, what made them difficult to deal with, and how you adapted or overcame that. If you were not able to overcome a conflict, don't use that story. Use a story in which there was a positive result, because every story should end in a positive outcome. They're left field questions. I don't find value in them myself, but they are occasionally asked. So I'm going to ask you one, and in the chat box, I'm going to have you give me an answer. Don't worry about this. Don't overthink it. Okay? But this isn't a question that was asked quite a bit a while back. If a hammer cost $1.10 together, so together they cost $1.10, and the hammer cost $1, how much does the nail cost? Answer into the chat box if you would. I'm going to bring up the chat box just to see what the answers are here. Okay, so we got 10 cents, you got 10 cents, $1.10. Yeah, so the $1.10 together, and the hammer cost $1 more than the nail. Now, obviously, the obvious answer is 10 cents, but that's not right. Because if the hammer costs $1 more than the nail, and the nail costs 10 cents, that means the hammer would cost $1.10. So together they'd be $1.20. If you're not following the math, that's okay. The answer is 5 cents. Okay, that's not the important part. The important part is don't snap to answering a question that is seemingly easy, because the employers who use this question, who find value in this question or similar questions, are just looking for your thought process. If you eventually come to 10 cents after thinking about it for a while, that's fine. It's not a math job. The idea is a process for solving problems. Do you think about something before you give an answer? And that's what they're really getting at. So if they ask, what kind of tree would you be, or what animal would you be, or what's your favorite movie, just don't throw out an answer and dismiss the question, because for some reason they find value in it. So at least consider it and don't judge their process. Okay? A lion. Someone answered what kind of animal they would be. I like that. All right. So next up, we're going to star stories. So star stories are all about the process by which we answer behavioral-based questions. So it stands for situation, task, action, result. I just think it really works out nice to say STAR. You could probably combine task and action a little bit, but there can be a case made that they're separate. The idea here is when you're asked a question like, give me a situation, a coworker, how did you handle it? What were the results? And that's a pretty typical behavioral-based question. Many of them revolve around conflict. And conflict resolution is such a key skill in any employment. How you get along with customers is great. Honestly, how you get along with coworkers is more indicative in many cases of career success, because you can handle people you don't disagree with, people you disagree with. And that's part of work every single day. So the idea here is S situation. You want to provide an example of a situation where you were involved in that had a positive outcome. That's the key. You're not to the positive outcome yet. You're talking about the situation, but you have to keep in your mind that this worked out well. So an example that I just gave about the a disagreement with a coworker, you could say, I was put on a team that had a requirement to get a manual out in 3 months. Not everyone could put the time forward that was needed for this project for us to get done on time. Notice how I said that instead of saying not everyone was pulling their weight. I didn't judge. I just said people weren't able to dedicate the time needed. Because it doesn't do you any good to complain about a former employee, employer, or customer. Just describe what was happening without judging. The task. I need to find a way to block off everyone's schedule so that we could get this done and put the time in that was needed. That's the task. The action was I put a repeating meeting on Mondays and Fridays after looking at everyone's availability, and put it as a repeating event and made sure that everyone knew this is what we needed to do. Result. Once we had organized the process to where it needed to be, everyone was able to work with their schedule to put enough time in for this process. Now, obviously, that would be something you'd want to word a lot better. You'd want to take that as a rough draft, and you'd want to say it a few times. You'd want to talk to somebody and say, do you understand what I'm saying here? And they would give you some feedback, and then you would create kind of this chart, star story, situation, task, action, result. You're not going to bring notes to an interview to answer questions. You're not even going to want to read it verbatim, but you are going to want to know the general outline of what you want to get across. The more star stories you create, the more you become familiar with the process, and the easier it becomes to answer any of those questions. Now, one of the things people always say is, I can't prepare for an interview because I don't know what questions they're going to ask. They generally don't ask crazy questions that have never been said before in an interview. You can look up the top 30, top 50 behavioral-based questions, and a great part of your work search strategy should be, I'm going to develop star stories for 5 questions. And you're going to find a cool thing. Once you develop those life experience star stories, they can be adjusted very easily to an enormous amount of questions. Many of the conflict questions that are asked, no matter how they ask them, you can use a story. I'm not saying you use the same story over and over within an interview. What I'm saying is you can use the same story for a variety of questions. So 5 to 10 good star stories can go a long way to answering most of the questions you're going to hear. I'm going to pause at this time to see if there are any questions.
Sure, we will try to get through several here. Is it okay to jot down notes during the interview?
I'd be careful with that. You'll hear differing, it depends on the interview itself. Sometimes the interview, they're asking highly technical questions, and you do need to write down notes. I try not to do too much with notes, either reviewing notes or writing down notes within an interview, because it's very hard to split your attention between what you're doing and what they're saying. I always bring a pad and a pencil, and I may take 1 or 2, but don't overdo it, because I've been in interviews where we've had to wait for someone, and it's just uncomfortable. So be careful with that.
When doing virtual interviews, should your resume be in a form where you can share it on your screen?
It would be highly unlikely they would ask you to do that. However, what you could do is you could have an email all prepped with the name of the viewer. You could have your resume attached, And if they ever say, gosh, I just can't, I don't have your resume in front of me, you hit send, and there it is. I don't think you should be able to do a screen share if required. That would be something they would probably prep you for. But one of the things I've seen in interviews is that if you have to do like a presentation during an interview, make sure you understand their process. Understand the platform as well as possible. Do a couple trials. Even within something like WebEx, there's multiple ways of sharing a presentation. And if something goes wrong, and by the way, in virtual, almost every single time something's going to go wrong. There's going to be an audio issue. There's going to be a disconnection. Apologize once for it and then move on. It happens. They're used to it. Have a backup plan. Make sure that you in the chat box, maybe I'm sending you, our audio gets disconnected. I've seen that save a job opportunity. You get disconnected, well, there's nothing I can do. You've lost that opportunity in many cases. But if you give them a phone number and they call you back, that shows your workaround abilities, your problem solving. So I'm going to be sending everyone specific video on video interviewing. It's one we had done in the past several months ago, and it talks about lighting and audio setup and that sort of thing, and you might find that helpful also.
Absolutely. Okay, one more for this little break, and then we'll get going. If you struggle with stress and you don't handle it well, if you've got some mental health that you're dealing with, like anxiety disorders, or you have panic attacks, what can you do before you interview?
Well, it's never going to go away completely. There's nothing I can say to anyone that's going to make those issues no longer an issue. The key is everyone is nervous in an interview. Some people, because of mental health issues, are extremely nervous. That's where it's really important to be as prepared. I've had, and this is a absolutely true story where someone had a panic attack within the interview I was giving. Okay, they had to excuse themselves. They went out into the hallway. It took 10 minutes. They came back. They finished the interview, and they got the job. Don't give up on an interview. Remember, I want you to succeed. I want you to do well because I want to get a good employee. And getting through the interview is sometimes, I may have decided before I even interview you. And if you're willing to do this very nerve-wracking, uncomfortable situation and put the effort in, sometimes that's what it takes. It's amazing what a little bit of preparation will do to help that. It gives you kind of a safety thing. I can go to what I know. I prepared for this. And yes, sometimes that'll mean that you come off a little bit scripted, but much better than that, than just not knowing what to say because you're overwhelmed by the situation. I would recommend, if it is a diagnosed mental health issue or disability, that you talk with vocational rehabilitation. You can have a conversation or orientation with that agency within the Career Force system, and they have specialized counselors that can help with those situations. All right, we're going to move on to make sure we get through everything. We're going to some of the key interview questions. So one of the tough ones right off the bat that a lot of people struggle with, and I talked a little bit about it before, is tell me about yourself. In many cases, this is the first question they ask. And it's probably the most scripted answer you're going to give because you anticipate it. It's your opportunity to make the connection for them. So it's not about how many kids you have. It's not about what you like to do in your spare time or your hobbies, whatever. It's about your professional life to this point that relates to this position. And it's a real good opportunity to show your passion for what you do. If you really like what you do, explain how you got into this industry, what resonated with you, and how you're taking that next step with this position. If you're changing industries, that is another opportunity. In the past, I had done this, as you can see from my resume, for many years. That industry is no longer viable in our area, and I made a very concerted effort towards upskilling towards this industry. And here's why I am very passionate about this. And that overcomes those objections for unrelated skill sets. It's a conscious decision to make this change in career. So that's the one that you should really, really practice. In 60 to 90 seconds. I don't need to hear a book, but I also don't want to hear 10 seconds of something either. People tend, if any question, people tend to overdo it on this one as far as for time. Also, that really preps that second question, why are you interested in working for this company? That's many times a question I would ask at the end of every interview. Two questions. One is, why are you interested in working here? And two, why should I hire you? Those questions really help me understand if this was just a job someone applied to because they were qualified, or a job that someone's really interested in. And remember, people who are interested in a position and are happy at that position last longer, so there's a bigger return on investment, and it's a better choice for the employer. It's not always the most qualified person that gets the job. Why would I interview at that point? I want to interview qualified people, but then at the interview, I want to see who's going to work out in this position. What's your major weakness? We did talk about that a little bit. Don't give a non-answer. Don't give the internet answer. And the internet answer is, well, I'm a perfectionist, and I spend a lot of time making sure that the customer gets exactly what they want. And sometimes that means I work late or come in on weekends, but hey, that's just me. I've heard that so many times, some version of that. I can't tell you. It's a non-answer. Now, if you truly are a perfectionist, that could be a weakness. Tell me why it's a weakness and what you're doing to overcome it. But don't just try to not answer the question. Also, don't throw yourself under the bus. Don't take yourself out of contention by giving too much information. So an example could be, if you're going to work in an office setting where it's almost, computers, but you might have to take notes or send notes to coworkers once in a while. You can say, I've worked in an office setting for the majority of my career. I consider myself to be a fairly skilled communicator, but my handwriting has never been as professional as I would like it to be. And customers really like that personal touch of getting a handwritten note or in communications with coworkers. So it's something I've been actively working on. It's something I practice. It's not where I need it to be right now, but it's something I've identified as something that needs to improve. Now, you say that's not a huge part of the job and it's a non-answer. It's at least an attempt at saying, here's what I'm working on. Here's what could make me a better employee. And here's the steps I'm taking. That's one you should have an answer to before they ask it. It's asked enough. And so many people give that very bland answer that you can really separate yourself by giving a personal answer. Now, what are your strengths? Oh my goodness. That's why you're there. That's your 5 goals. Here's the 5 strengths I have. Pick one. If they say, what are your 1 strength? Think of, what do I do well that they're asking for that's the most important part of the job? And then be willing to talk about that. Most people have a very hard time coming up with even 10 skills. Now, if you come up with 10 skills you have, all of those might not be needed for this position. So try to figure out 20 skills you have. Skills identification, as we had talked about in an earlier presentation within this series, is the first step in your employment journey or your job search journey. At this stage, you should have that well in hand. If you haven't, take the tips from the job posting. Look at, why did I apply to this? What are their qualifications that I think I can fulfill? And then give one of those as your strength. And then the behavioral-based questions, an example of how you solved a problem. And that's one of the core categories. Conflict resolution is one. Problem solving is another one. There's 5 or 6 general categories, but those are 2 of the biggest ones. Problem solving is huge. And then this one has been, in the last 5 years of doing this, I've been doing this for about 20 years. In the last 5 years, I've got more questions on this particular question than any of them. Where do you see yourself in 3 years? People can take that a bunch of different ways. And some people will take it as, I'm an older worker and they're wondering if I'm going to retire. Well, maybe they are. I'm a young worker and they're thinking I'm going to leave this position. Well, maybe they are. Anticipate any reluctance they would have to hire you for whatever reason. And this is an example of, hey, I've thought about how I can pay off for this employer in the 3 years. So it could be something as simple as, I'm very interested in this position, but one of the things that really attracted me to this company is the possibility of my career within this company, to grow within this job, starting at this job, learning this job, performing at this job. But I do understand that the next career step is a claims processor. And that would be something within 3 years that I would probably be looking at. It shows that you are looking to grow within this company. Now, there's a lot of different ways to answer that question, and it's another great example of reaching out to a career force specialist and with your particular situation to develop some strategies. Just a minute, but mock interview, I want to mention this one more time. Reach out to your local career force location from the location finder that I'll send you, or the list of all 50. It starts off with an email or a phone call, but it'll take a few days. You can actually send the job posting and your resume along if you have an interview coming up. If you just want to practice some standard questions, you can have the interviewer put them out for you. Just ask me some standard question. They'll give you some feedback. You can do this over the phone. You can do it through a platform. We have access to WebEx generally and Teams, possibly Skype for a little bit longer. Some people do Zoom. The more that you become familiar with, the easier it will be. But don't be thrown if the interviewer has a platform you haven't experienced yet. Most of them are somewhat similar, and we'll do the best we can to get the most relevant one for you. Make sure that you contact your references. You want to recap the interview to them, tell them what you thought went well, highlights that you want them to discuss should they get a call, and hopefully they will. By the way, if they don't ask for your references by the end of the interview, I always offer it. I'll say, I just wanted to make sure I gave you a copy of my references. Sometimes they forget, and they're probably going to have to check those. Sometimes it's part of the application process. Oh, be aware, in an interview, many employers do not have your resume, or do not have your application. That's HR. They're looking at your resume. So if you had something on your application that you're just assuming the interview panel has, they might not. So I learned that the hard way in a couple of interviews I did. And then it's always professional to send a thank you. A lot of people think, well, no one's going to get it because no one's in their office. Well, people are coming back to work. I would still send one out, but I would send an email that night. Follow it up with a handwritten, or if you have handwriting like mine, maybe you can type it out and send it that next day. Follow up a week later to see where they are at the process, if that's applicable based on their instructions to you. I've even followed up with a updated resume or a letter of recommendation a week later if I haven't heard from them. All right, we just got 1 minute here to look at any other questions that you had.
Yes, 2 questions I'm hoping we can get through. First,
I'll stick around.
Okay. How do you best assess a corporate culture during an interview? What's the question that you ask?
I always like saying is, what makes someone successful in this position? Because that looks different based on the culture of that business. I really like having them think about it. I don't ask them yes/no questions. When you ask that question, they try to think about, oh gosh, in this position we don't work 9 to 5. We work as the job needs. Sometimes that means we're done at 2. Sometimes that means we work till 8 at night. Flexibility is the key to being successful in this position. And then I'll talk about the culture. Other employers might say something like, we value our time here. And it's really important that everyone be highly productive because we only require you for 8 hours a day. We understand that family life is equally important to the whole self. That's going to tell you a lot about the culture of the business and asking what would make someone successful in this position. That's just one tactic.
All right. So say you're close to getting an offer or you're getting an offer, but the pay is lower than another job. Can you take the offer but then leave when the better offer is made? I feel like this is bridge burning, but
it's tough. It's some of the toughest things we do. Hopefully it's tough. That means that you're thinking about it the right way. it's really hard to turn down an offer for a potentially better offer. When I first started working with Deed, we had someone who was just awesome. They got a job, and it was so great to work with them. And then a month later, they left for their dream job. Well, they were in process with that dream job, and they had to take it. It was everything they ever wanted. The one thing I want to make sure everyone understands is don't just look at the pay. This is a mistake a lot of people make. Look at the whole picture. And one of the parts of the whole picture, yeah, benefits, all the things of benefits are really important. But also, are you going to be happy there? I would gladly do a job for a couple bucks less an hour that I was fulfilled at, that I could see myself long term. People take a job only based on what they're offering, and there's so much more to consider. However, if a great job lands into your lap right after you took another job, yeah, it stinks for that employer, but they haven't invested a whole lot in training at this point. They got to start the process all over. They're not going to be happy, but sometimes that's a decision we have to make for us and our family. All right. Nope. We are at a little overtime. Thank you so much, everybody. Next week is Job Search Over 50. That link to that will be sent in the notes I send you tomorrow. Marnie, I'll let you close it up.
All right. Thank you so much. We put a lot of links out there, and we will have a lot in the follow-up email. You will be getting the recording, the slides, and the speaker notes, and lots of great handouts. And we thank you so much for your time and attention and all your questions. We'll try to get back to you, but please use this as a springboard. Your attendance today, use it as a springboard to contacting your local staff and getting in touch with them so that you can talk more extensively about your specific situation and your questions. Thanks again, and have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.